Welcome. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I'm Bonnie Glaser. I'm director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And welcome to today's event on a very important new piece of legislation that was introduced in the House of Representatives last June. The bill is called the Taiwan Peace and Stability Act, and it is co-sponsored by Chairman of the Asia Subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Ami Bera, and Ranking Member Steve Chabot. They both introduced the legislation. The United States has very strong interests in Taiwan. Taiwan shares our democratic values. With a population of under 24 million people, Taiwan's economy ranks 21st globally measured in GDP. It's the United States' 9th largest trading partner and our 7th largest destination for agricultural exports. Taiwan is also one of the world's leading producers of advanced information and communications technologies, including semiconductors, where it's a crucial link in global supply chains. Taiwan provides humanitarian and medical assistance to many countries, and it has stood out as a leader during the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, Taiwan has advanced expertise that the world can benefit greatly from, including areas such as disaster relief, public health, law enforcement, energy, media literacy, women's empowerment, and cybersecurity. The Taiwan Peace and Stability Act states, and here I quote, "In order to ensure the longevity of U.S. policy and preserve the ability of the people of Taiwan to determine their future independently, it is necessary to reinforce Taiwan's diplomatic, economic, and physical space." So today we're going to discuss the bill and what steps the United States should take to strengthen Taiwan's security. I am delighted to have with us today both Congressman Bera and Congressman Chabot, which demonstrates that support for Taiwan in Congress is indeed bipartisan. In a minute, I'm going to turn the virtual floor over to each of the congressmen for a few minutes of remarks. Then I'll pose some questions. We'll have a conversation. And in the meantime, if you have a question that you would like to pose to the congressman about U.S. policy toward Taiwan and the Taiwan Peace and Stability Act in particular, please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we kindly request that you include your name and affiliation when submitting your questions. So thank you so much, Congressman Bera and Chabot, for joining us today and for your leadership in Congress on Taiwan and so many other issues. So I'd like to turn the floor first over to Congressman Bera for your remarks.
Thanks, Bonnie, for that generous introduction and kind of the overview and the framework of the Taiwan Peace and Stability Act. And it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with my good friend, Steve Chabot, who has been a leader on these issues. He's been in Congress a little bit longer than I have, but in my 5 terms, the issue of Taiwan and the friendship between the people of the United States and the people and residents of Taiwan has always been a nonpartisan issue. My introduction to this came traveling there with our former chairman, Ed Royce, and again, it's never been a partisan issue. I think in my opening comments, instead of getting into the bill, which we'll get into the bill, what's changed hasn't been how the United States looks at our relationship with Taiwan, as well as more broadly China. I think what's changed is there's no ambiguity in Xi Jinping, who's kind of laid out where China is headed. And while the Chinese will often say, well, we're changing our posture because of what the United States has changed, our support of the people of Taiwan, this economic success that Taiwan has had, hasn't really changed. The fact that we think Taiwan should be part of the international community because they have a lot to contribute. The economic ties between the United States and the people of Taiwan, none of that's changed, and we haven't articulated any policy different than the one China policy. What's changed is the Chinese posture to the region, Xi Jinping's aggressiveness across the straits, and so forth, which is forcing us to rethink, the ability and the will of the Chinese or the people of Taiwan to choose their own direction and their own role, which has again been fairly successful. We've also noticed, as the Biden administration's come into office, they really have started to rebuild multilateral relationships, starting with some of the 2x2s with Japan and Korea. You've also seen, the G7 talk about Taiwan in a very strategic way. You've seen the Japanese talk about Taiwan. And the goal here is, again, I don't want to say we want to maintain the status quo, but we want to maintain the ability for the people of Taiwan to choose their direction and their path forward. We also want to, I'll use the term strategic deterrence. We want to make sure that China understands that the status quo, allowing Taiwan to pick its own direction, while again maintaining a one China policy, has been very successful in the region, and that the rest of the world really does want to maintain what's been very successful. And any change from that would not be a good idea. So as we think about the deterrence approach, it really is China that's changed its posture and the level of aggression. And I think that's some of the drive. When Steve and I started talking about the Peace and Stability Act, how we could speak on behalf of Congress in a nonpartisan way to show our support of the people of Taiwan, but also to really, in a systematic way, think about how we could, help the international community bring Taiwan into, international organizations, because they have a lot to offer. How we could strengthen our economic ties and our economic relations with Taiwan, but then also, how we could do an assessment and work with the people of Taiwan so that they could, enhance their own self-defense and deterrence capabilities. So I'll stop with that, and let me pass it back to you, Bonnie.
Great, thank you so much, Congressman Bera. We'll turn to you now, Congressman Chabot, to hear your perspectives before we get into our discussion.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie, and thank you to the German Marshall Fund for hosting myself and my good friend Ami Bera, who's the chair of the Asia and Pacific and Central Asia and Nonproliferation, which is a subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I actually was the chair of this subcommittee about 10 years ago, and my ranking member at that time was another member of Congress, Ini Vega from American Samoa. And Ini had some health issues, and he's since passed, and it was a great member, and I enjoyed traveling with him to various places. But when he had those issues, Ami stepped in and became the ranking member in his stead. And so I was the chair, and Ami was my ranking member. And now he's the chair, and I'm his ranking member. So fortunately, I treated him pretty well back in the day, because he treats me very well right now, and we get along great. And even though we're different parties, there can be bipartisanship on Capitol Hill. I know you don't see enough of it, but in this case, we actually do work together. And as you've indicated, we've co-sponsored this legislation, the Taiwan Peace and Stability Act, together. It's a compromise. I might have done things a little bit differently here and there. Ami may be a little bit differently, but we wanted it to be bipartisan, so it's a good bill. It would have been better if he'd have just listened to me, and all my stuff would have got in there. But it's okay. And we're also here to discuss, obviously, a very timely topic, and that's deterrence in Taiwan Strait, and really any other issues that anybody wants to talk about Taiwan. As a founder and co-chair of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, I actually was one of two Republicans, 2 Democrats that founded the Taiwan Caucus, which is now the largest caucus, more members than any other in Congress. Number 2 now is India, even though when you consider there's 1.4 billion people in India and 23 million, I think, in Taiwan now. But Taiwan has surpassed India in the caucus. Now, I say that, kind of maybe bragging a little bit, but also I'm a little sad because I'm also co-chair of the India caucus too. So I'm co-chair of both of them. But I've been working on issues related to Taiwan for quite some time, over 2 decades now, and I'm very pleased by the support and interest that both Democratic and Republican members of Congress have taken on this critically important issue, as evidenced by the growth of the caucus, as I mentioned. Taiwan deserves our support because they're in a dangerous position. There's no question about that, a position that appears to grow more dangerous by the day, unfortunately. Chairman Xi has made conquering Taiwan a key component of his legacy. And the PRC has become increasingly aggressive toward Taiwan, routinely sending warplanes to menace the island and conducting other provocative pre-invasion-like exercises. U.S. Admiral Davidson testified recently that he believes that we could see an invasion within the next 6 years. With this in mind, I was pleased to work with Chairman Bera on our important legislation. Not only does it create tools to help counter Beijing's coercion of Taiwan in the diplomatic and economic spheres, but more importantly, I believe it supports hard power deterrence, which could ultimately be what prevents such an invasion. Peace through strength, ours, Taiwan's, and our allies. And in light of the PRC's increasingly aggressive behavior, let me be clear, Taiwan needs to take its own defense more seriously. Defense spending is up somewhat, but it needs to increase, I believe, considerably in Taiwan. And how the money is spent is important. Rather than principally expensive, sophisticated defense systems, asymmetric capabilities must be considered. Rather than principally relying upon a small number of high-end planes and tanks, Taiwan needs a lot of small, mobile, lethal weaponry deployed throughout the country. And the defense of Taiwan needs to go beyond its military forces, even beyond its reserves, to a whole of society effort. Getting deterrence right so she doesn't invade is the goal. Weakness, a lack of commitment, or a lack of clarity sends the wrong message to Beijing and invites a miscalculation on their part. I look forward to discussing how we can deter that from happening and how our legislation contributes to that effort. So thank you, and I'll yield back.
Well, thank you. I'm very glad that, Congressman, you mentioned that defense is, in fact, a whole of society effort. I completely agree. The military may be out in front, but I believe that Taiwan needs to build more of a territorial defense. That involves the civilians in various capacities that will signal the PRC as well as the United States of its determination to defend itself. And that is such an important part of deterrence. So let me pose a question, because we haven't really talked about the specifics of the Taiwan Peace and Stability Act. Maybe each of you can highlight one or two things that you think are particularly important for the United States to do to strengthen Taiwan's peace and stability in the Strait, but also, of course, its durability and resilience. And also maybe one or two things that you think our allies and partners should be doing. And here I represent the German Marshall Fund, we really want to get Europe more vested in Taiwan and in the resilience of Taiwan. And as you mentioned, Congressman Bera, in the G7, the US-EU statement, there were really unprecedented statements about Taiwan, the need to preserve peace and stability, and to encourage a dialogue across the Strait. And obviously, there is more that Europe can do, and other allies and partners in Asia. So maybe you can speak to some of those issues. And we'll start with you, Congressman Bera.
Sure. Maybe I'll start with that first piece. What can we do as an international community to help strengthen Taiwan's independence as a sense and maintain that status quo? The Europeans, and particularly European parliamentarians and individual countries have, certainly been communicating with us much more frequently about their concerns of Chinese aggression across the straits, and the ability to try to deter any Chinese miscalculation here, for lack of a better way of describing it. I think one thing, and one of the key planks of the Peace and Stability Act, was taking a very strategic approach to strengthening Taiwan's participation in international organizations, in the international community. And I don't think we've done a great job here. And I think China has done a pretty masterful job at building coalitions that have led to Taiwan's exclusion in organizations like the WHO and others. And China has used various tools from economic coercion, but I think their biggest tool has been that they actually have been present at the table building these coalitions, gathering the votes that directly or indirectly have excluded Taiwan's participation. In our bill, we ask for a very strategic approach and a long-term approach at how we think about and develop a strategy to further Taiwan's participation in the international community. I think that's a place where we can work very closely with our European allies. I think, I think what Lithuania did recently, took a lot of courage, but we should support, if there's economic fallback and blowback that China puts pressure on a country like Lithuania, we should think about ways that we could support those countries, both as the United States, the EU, but also our partnership. And we're seeing pressures on Honduras and other places. So I think we have to have a long-term strategy, and I think that's what we're asking for in this bill, to strengthen and have a strategic long-term approach to broaden Taiwan's participation in the international community. We can also do that through more formal trade and economic development and ties, and that's the second part of this bill, is really formalizing the trade and economic ties and economic exchanges between the countries. Since Steve talked about some of the defense measures and so forth, which are the third component, maybe I'll leave that for Steve to talk about that piece of it.
Congressman Chabot.
Okay, thank you. And yes, there are three parts to the bill, and Ami has covered the first two pretty well, and I agree with him, on all the things that he mentioned there. And I do want to commend the administration, because I don't get to commend this administration too often, but they have actually worked with our allies to speak out more, Japan and South Korea and others. And I commend them for coming out and pushing back and countering the PRC and some of its aggressive behaviors against Taiwan. So it may be a few more months or a few more years before I get to commend them again, but we were kind of all over the Secretary of State yesterday on Afghanistan, so I can at least say something nice about them here today. And also in the economic space, as Ami mentioned, that's another area where we really do need to work with the U.S. Trade Representative, for example, and we've directed the State Department to come up with a strategy, so we do need to be much more strategic. But as I mentioned before, I think one of the keys in the defense area, in the deterrence area, is that we tend to think, and I think Taiwan thinks in the sense of, we need expensive and sophisticated planes and missiles and tanks. And yes, they do need those. But I personally think it's really the asymmetric defense strategy that's going to be the key. And it has to be a whole of society, not just the military and not just the reserves, but the people themselves. I sometimes am concerned that the population overall, because it's been a while and some of the people are, or Chiang Kai-shek in those years are a long time gone. Those are grandpa and grandma that have any kind of memories, or great grandma and great grandpa. But the young people right now, I don't think oftentimes they see the PRC necessarily as much of a threat. And I think they really are a threat. So I'm concerned that maybe we take the threat of the PRC more seriously than the people themselves. And I'm not saying everybody, and I'm not saying all elected officials, but we've had a hard time over the years. I go back 25 years here, getting the legislative one to pass defense budgets. Even at times when the U.S. wanted to pass them, we were willing to, to take our hits with China. They couldn't get it through the legislature over there. So they really do need to step up, both in increasing the amount of money that they spend, and also involving all of the people of Taiwan in a military defense effort. And if they do that and they take it seriously, and most importantly, if the PRC sees this happening, I think the fact that they'll ever have to use it is greatly diminished. So that's very important, and hopefully they will understand that as well. By being prepared for military confrontation, it's less likely that it'll actually happen.
And Bonnie, if I could just add on to what Steve said, there's a lot in our bill, talking about doing that self-assessment, having our DoD, make that assessment and recommendations on how Taiwan can best increase its own self-defense capabilities. But there's also other vehicles that we're thinking about, with the Armed Services Committee and the NDAA. We have a system of National Guard reserves and so forth. Can we, through our states and our state National Guards, do some joint training and joint exercises to help Taiwan build up their own capabilities to have some sort of reserve system like that? And it's been very successful in the state of California. We work with India and other countries with our National Guard going over there. So I think there are some vehicles that I think Steve and I want to see the Taiwan Peace and Stability Act pass either as a standalone, as part of a more broad, comprehensive bill. But I think that you will see some movement on other areas through the NDAA, et cetera. And the second component, Steve touched on it, and Bonnie, you touched on it a little bit, is that asymmetric component. And it's not just building the asymmetric capabilities, but it's also doing an assessment and hardening their own internal structures, against cyber threats, but also a malign political influence. Because I think that is one tactic that the CCP will use as you come into the next cycle of Taiwanese elections, is to try to influence the outcome of those elections. And it may not be a strategy of external kinetic confrontation if you erode, kind of Taiwan independence or autonomy from within, and you have, I don't suspect it's going to happen, but that certainly is a strategy that we worry about. Is the Chinese are pretty good at using their tools of political influence and interference as they go into elections, and certainly think Taiwan has to think through some of those, as do we.
Yes, the Chinese have been using what they refer to as united front tactics against Taiwan ever since, of course, 1949. So there's a whole set of political warfare, hybrid warfare tactics that they use that are really aimed at demoralizing the Taiwanese people and trying to persuade them that they have no options other than to reunify with the People's Republic of China in some way. And that is why I agree that there are elements of this bill that would strengthen Taiwan's resilience and its confidence in itself, and strengthen the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. And all of that is very important in resisting these pressures that come from the PRC. So let me dig in a little bit to the economic piece, because this is, in my view, the weakest part of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. It just has not kept up with some of the other areas of cooperation. We know that Taiwan has been interested for some time in signing a bilateral free trade agreement with the United States. They've also expressed an interest in an accord on eliminating double taxation. Finally, we have resumed what we call the TIFA talks, the trade and investment framework talks. We had one round of that about a month ago. But Taiwan's been excluded from regional trade agreements such as RCEP, CPTPP, and other countries are not negotiating right now free trade agreements with Taiwan. Recently, the EU Parliament has put out this report calling for an investment agreement between Europe and Taiwan. I think that's a very good proposal as well. But it's my sense that there are divisions between and maybe within the congressional branches of government, different parties, different committees, and also divisions perhaps within the executive branch over how to develop this economic relationship with Taiwan, and particularly over a bilateral free trade agreement. So can you comment on that?
Steve, you want to start?
Okay, I'll touch on it, and then you can clean up for me, Ami. Yeah, I think you stated it very, very well, Bonnie. And I've always been a free trader myself, and I've always been a big backer of a free trade agreement with Taiwan. I'd like to see that happen, especially since Taiwan, took steps to reduce its market access barriers on, for example, pork and beef not too long ago. So I would very much like to see us in negotiations about actually getting that done. Now, is that realistic? I'd like to think it is, but Congress itself, the previous administration had not liked regional free trade agreements. They preferred bilateral ones, one-on-one. And of course, with TPP, and this came up in a previous meeting that Ami and I both had before this meeting, where one of the people panelists mentioned the TPP, and I personally think that was an example of a boneheaded decision by both of our presidential level campaigns back in 2016, when they were both against it. And so rather than the U.S. working with our allies like Japan and South Korea and New Zealand and on, to set the rules and have as much openness and low tariffs as possible and create jobs, both of the candidates were against it. And so we pulled out, and now China gets to write the rules and we know how that's going to go. So now we're trying to maybe think about getting back in, but that may not work. So, and you mentioned the double taxation agreement, and that certainly would be a good thing to consider, and maybe we could advance more economic integration. And but overall, I would like to see us increase, as much, and we have pretty good trade with, as you mentioned in the first part of this, pretty good trade back and forth between the United States and Taiwan. But I think if we could actually enter into a trade agreement, that would be a step in the right direction and help both countries.
Great. So this is another area where Steve and I are on the same page, and I think a lot of our colleagues are as well, in terms of the mistake of not getting TPP across the finish line. As much as I'd love to say we're going to revive CPTPP, that might be a hill too far to go. Although I do think there are a number of members of Congress, House and Senate, that have regrets that we didn't get that deal completed. Outside of that, though, are there areas where we can make progress in a multilateral approach? And I would argue that we probably can do something in the digital trade environment. And I think you'll see, certainly the subcommittee, the full committee HVAC sending some of those signals in that direction, that we do think in a bipartisan way, the administration should explore what digital trade might look like. And I think that's an area where, you might not start with Taiwan, but you might, be able to find some places where Taiwan can participate on the digital trade realm. A bilateral formal trade deal with Taiwan, might be difficult to push, but I think can we enhance, trade and investment opportunities, and that is written into the bill in Section 202, asking USTR to, come to present Congress a legal template by which we could establish greater trade and investment agreements with Taiwan. I think that's really important. I'm glad to hear, Bonnie, that Europe is also thinking about how to enhance those investment opportunities. And Taiwan is helping us deal with a real challenge in the semiconductor space, and I think there's that also is a way for us to signal to the American people why Taiwan is incredibly important. This is a very developed, advanced economy, and they're going to help us build our own resiliency. And I think Taiwan, in the economic space, we can look for other places where they can help us build redundancy in supply chains, and certainly create an investment climate that allows Taiwan to continue investing in the United States, address our issues. But we do want to see more US flows into Taiwan as well. So I do think that, in a more formal way also then enhances the deterrence.
I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have been coming into the Q&A. And again, if you joined us late, you can send in a question through the Q&A box with the tab is at the bottom of your screen, and please do send your name and your affiliation. And there are two questions that relate to a recent report that was actually in the Financial Times that the Biden administration is considering changing the name of Taiwan's representative office in Washington, which of course today it is called the Taipei Economic and Representative and Cultural Office, and it's called TECRO. And the Congressman Bera, you mentioned earlier Lithuania, which of course has now opened and Taiwan opened an office in Lithuania's capital in Vilnius, and for the first time in a country that has diplomatic ties with the People's Republic of China, this office used the name, it's called the Taiwanese Representative Office, although in Mandarin Chinese, it's called the Taiwan Representative Office. And so there's a couple of questions regarding this about whether it is advisable, should the United States rename this office, why or why not? How should we take into consideration some of the threats that we've already seen come out of China? There was a Global Times article yesterday. I myself don't think that this is the most authoritative source of signaling that the People's Republic of China does. But nevertheless, it should be taken seriously. There were threats that the PLA would overfly Taiwan, and even mention, I think, by some Chinese of the possibility of withdrawing their ambassador from the United States. And this is indeed what the PRC did with Lithuania. They withdrew, they recalled their ambassador. So there's a question, Tina Chung, Voice of America, was interested in how we should respond to these Chinese reactions. Should we take them into account? And another question from an anonymous person about how you assess these reactions from the PRC, and again, whether this is an advisable action for the US to take. So which one of you would like to start?
Maybe I'll start and then pass it over to Steve. I certainly don't think there's any danger in our talking about it. I think it does give us a little bit of leverage. It does give us the ability to, think about changing the name, but it should be in part of a broader context and a broader strategy as well. And I don't think we should be thinking about this in isolation. Hopefully we're the administration's talking to, other like-valued countries and allies to get a sense of how they're thinking about it. I also do think you'll see, as the CCPs and the PRC wants to do, you'll see some saber rattling and so forth. But the United States is not Lithuania, so I don't think, the threat of withdrawing your ambassador, at the end of the day, I think that would be, an overreaction on their part. But I don't underestimate Chinese overreactions as well, because we've seen it in a number of other venues. So I'm not one who says quickly, let's change the name, but I'm also not one who says, let's take that consideration off the table either. I think it should be part of a broader strategy and, a stepwise. And I would make sure that as we message it, and how I look at this is, we're not the ones changing the calculus here. We've had a formula that has really served the people of Taiwan and the rest of the world very well for the past number of decades. It's China and Xi Jinping that's changed the calculus here, which is forcing the United States and the rest of the world to rethink, how we allow the people of Taiwan to continue to determine their future and path forward. I don't know, Steve, you might feel slightly differently.
Yeah. Well, I'm still annoyed by watching the Olympics and having to see Taiwan referred to as Chinese Taipei. And I'm sure a lot of people in Taiwan are as well. Now, I was very, very pleased to see the Americans not only winning the most medals overall, but the most gold medals too, and beating the PRC in that respect. Wow. So in any event, but in all seriousness, well, I was serious about that because I was annoyed by that. But I think, to some degree, sometimes symbolism is substance when it comes to Taiwan, and the PRC is always going to be aggravated. In essence, they don't want to see anything that even approaches sovereignty, and they've been bullying Taiwan for decades now. And the smallest thing, they blow up and they try to get people to dump on not just Taiwan but us. And we've seen American institutions like the NBA and others that have gone over and kowtowed to the PRC, and many American businesses and the movie industry and just a whole range of people have gone over and kissed the ring. And I find that annoying and offensive as well. But I do think that I think things like, having our AIT director be the representative of the United States makes sense. And we ought to move forward on that type of thing. Having confirmation of the AIT director be by the Senate, I think would elevate that more to the stature of an ambassador. So yes, those things are going to tweak or rile up the PRC, no doubt about that. But what else is new? Everything that we do that in any way gives credibility to Taiwan, they're going to take offense to it. I want to avoid military confrontation at all costs as well. But I do think that that allowing, because Taiwan hasn't officially declared independence, although they are a de facto independent nation. But I think short of that, a lot of these things I do think have meaning and are important. And therefore, I think we ought to support.
We have a question from Mia Tanaka. Oh, Congressman Bera, did you have anything else you wanted to add? I'm sorry.
No, good.
Okay. We have a question from Mia Tanaka, who is with Japan's Kyoto News Agency. And she asked a really good question about what the role of the Quad might be on Taiwan issues. And we just saw a few weeks ago a foreign minister's statement from Quad countries, from Japan, Australia, the United States, and India, actually mentioned Taiwan for the first time. So that may be a preview of what we might see at the upcoming Quad meeting, which will be in person this time in the United States. So I wonder if you might have some thoughts on what else the Quad could do, other than perhaps mentioning that peace and stability should be preserved in the Taiwan Strait in an upcoming statement. Do you think that there is a role for the Quad to play to strengthen Taiwan's security?
Amy, you want to go, or Ami, you want to go, or you want me to go?
You can go ahead and start, and then.
Okay, I'll be brief. It's interesting that you'd asked the question, because actually Ami and I were at a dinner a few months back with the Quad members, and it was very enjoyable, discussion. And I think they were going to have a much more elevated role, and I think it's actually very important, particularly when you see what one of the members of the Quad, Australia, when they, for example, spoke out on the origins of the COVID pandemic and other things. The PRC has been acted in a very harsh and bullying manner with respect to one of our key allies in the region, Australia. So I think the Quad members do need to work together, Japan and Australia and India and the United States. And I think there's a whole range of things, from diplomatic to economic to military, that we can work together. Some might refer to that as, well, that's countering the PRC, and to some degree that may be the case, but it's a non-hostile, non-military way. These are countries that have key principles. We're all democracies. We believe in freedom of speech and not oppressing minorities, and a whole range of things which the PRC doesn't care at all about. When you look at the way they treat the Uyghurs or the Falun Gong or Tibet or the people of Hong Kong. So I think the democracies in the region do need to work together. And then we have to make a decision as to, we bring in other allies within the region and expand the Quad. That's for probably somewhere down the road to talk about that. I'll turn it over to Ami.
Thanks. I think when we think about the Quad, we should think about it not just with regards to how the Quad thinks about Taiwan, but certainly the entire region. And the region's different today than it was a decade ago, or even 4 or 5 years ago. And that largely is because the direction Xi Jinping has taken the PRC and the level of aggression. 4 or 5 years ago, I would have said, I think the Australians are too laissez-faire when it comes to China. That clearly is not the case today, based on, I think some of the economic coercion and retaliatory measures that Xi Jinping's taken towards Australia. And Australia's come through this, I don't want to say unscathed, but relatively unscathed and much more determined. The Chinese incursions on India's northern border certainly has turned Indian public sentiment against China. Whether the Indians are ready to more formally, elevate some of these alliances, the fact that they're willing to make statements, I think, is a really important step. Certainly Japan is paying attention to, what China is doing across the Taiwan Straits and in the East China Sea. But also, we're all paying attention to, and Steve and I were just on a briefing with our subcommittee colleagues on what China has done in the South China Sea, and the level of going against international norms, territorial boundaries, et cetera. So there's a real recognition that Xi Jinping and the level of aggression that the PRC has taken in the region has forced us to recalibrate and rethink how we think about the PRC. And I say that very intentionally, because they'll try to frame this as the United States is forcing them to make changes. That is absolutely inaccurate. They're forcing changes, and they're forcing real concerns from the countries in the region. Look, we being competitors is fine. You know, I'm happy to be economic competitors on a playing field that's, you know, ruled by international norms and standards and laws. That is not the Chinese approach, and I think that's why you're seeing these coalitions come together. I think it was, you know, incredibly important, you know, when President Biden and Prime Minister Suga had their you know, summit, that, you know, Taiwan is prominently mentioned, and we already talked about the G7. I think there's a recognition that Taiwan is different than Hong Kong. Hong Kong is part of territorial China. We're, you know, in a bipartisan way, you know, Congress and I think the rest of the world has spoken out in terms of, you know, our defense of the people of Hong Kong and, you know, of China just throwing out international agreements. Taiwan would be very different because this is a independent, you know, functioning democracy, developed economy. And yeah, I think Xi Jinping needs to understand that. The Chinese Communist Party needs to understand that we're not the ones changing the status quo, they are. So back to the original question, I think Japan is very aware and alert to what's happening in the region, in the Straits. I think you'll see that reflected in, you know, outside of the current political situation in Japan. I think you'll see it reflected in, you know, the Japanese budget in terms of, you know, what they're willing to spend on their defensive capabilities and so forth. I think you're seeing that in the Koreans as they talk about building their own defense capabilities. Certainly that's geared towards North Korea, but I think they're very conscious of what's happening in the region as well. And you know, I think those are areas that we, the United States and others, can work more closely with our allies in Japan and Korea. And I do think it's, you know, incredibly important that the Quad has been elevated to the leaders level, and you're actually seeing substantive, you know, around COVID, around vaccine development and deployment. You're seeing real concrete agreements come out of the Quad. Steve touched on, you know, is there an opportunity to expand the Quad? You know, there certainly are those conversations. I don't know if the countries in the region, you know, want to go so formal as to join that partnership, but I think there are real opportunities to create other alliances of like-valued, you know, countries to come together that really want to see a rules-based order, the ability of freedom of navigation, movement of goods and services, the ability of people in the region to choose their own path forward, and, you know, how they would like to rule and so forth. And I do think we have to work together to combat some of the economic coercion and coercive tools that we see China is certainly doing. And, you know, I don't know exactly what form Build Back Better world will take place, but I think that I would like to see that more formally, you know, come together, where we can work together to both, you know, foster investment and development in the ASEAN nations and others. So
I'm going to roll together two defense-related questions. One is from Ivo Rajinka, an international lawyer from Berlin, who is interested in what role NATO might play in Taiwan's security. And the other defense-related question comes specifically from the Taiwan Peace and Stability Act, and it's from Michael Fante, who is the mission director of the DPP office in Washington, D.C. And he quotes a section in which the act calls for considering enhancing co-development and co-deployment of military capabilities related to deterrence over a cross-strait conflict, or enhancing coordinated training of Taiwan's military forces. And he's interested in any details you might provide on issues related to things like co-development and co-deployment. I would just comment briefly that I see co-development as something that should really be looked at seriously. One of the problems I think we face is that the United States really is the only country that sells weapons to Taiwan. We don't necessarily make in the United States what Taiwan needs. The diesel submarines was just one example. The US does not produce and perhaps should not produce diesel submarines. And Taiwan had to work with commercially with some companies, not just from the United States, but is attempting to build their own. But there are other capabilities that Taiwan might need to acquire that our defense companies just do not manufacture. So it seems to me co-development really might make a lot of sense going forward. So I'd be interested in your comments on either or both of those topics.
Sure, certainly, Steve. Maybe I'll start and then kick it over to you.
Sure.
Steve and I have talked about this a little bit. I think both of us probably share your view, Bonnie, that there is some importance that, again, Taiwan's an advanced economy. It has capabilities, and it probably does have the ability to produce self-defense missiles and anti-ship missiles and the like, again, for deterrence capabilities and defensive capabilities. And there may be things based on export controls and other areas that our companies just are not going to do, but that Taiwan can do on its own. And I think the reason we included that in there without being prescriptive is to just say, what would that look like? And then on the second piece, I touched on something that you might see us try to insert into the NDAA is, we've talked about the reserve capabilities and helping Taiwan build up its a National Guard equivalent and reserve capabilities. One thing we think we ought to consider is, again, some of the state to Taiwan relationships where we might have some of our state National Guards go in, do some joint training exercises, help them develop what that might look like. And while that's not explicit in our bill, perhaps in the NDAA, that is something that we'll work with the Armed Services Committee and the appropriators to have some language included. But we think that also is a good, more formal step. Steve, let me turn it over to you.
Okay, maybe just to add one area, because I don't want to repeat all the things that Ami said. There's some sentiment that we might want to consider kind of pre-positioning some of our munitions and equipment at certain locations in Taiwan in case there was a military confrontation. Because obviously the PRC is right across the Taiwan Strait and can be there in minutes, literally. Whereas, we've got thousands of miles of an ocean, although obviously one can go by air, but it's going to take us a while to get our fleet and other resources there. So we ought to be considering pre-positioning, as I mentioned, things like munitions and other equipment that could be used both by the Taiwanese and by our forces as well by the time they actually do get there. So that's something relatively new. We do that with Israel, for example, now. We do that with the EU, for example, now. And I think we ought to consider that with Taiwan. In the question, NATO came up. One concern that I have, I'm hoping that the whole, chaotic pullout in Afghanistan isn't going to sour our NATO allies from, thinking that the U.S. isn't a dependable ally down the road because of what happened there. Not giving a lot of notice, not really caring what they did, and then just kind of pulling out in the middle of the night, and not only not telling our Afghan allies, but not telling our NATO allies that we were heading for the exit. So that's been such a debacle of epic proportions. So I hope that we're not permanently scarred by that in other parts of the globe. But Ami's not Secretary Blinken, so I'll stop there, and I'm not blaming Ami. So even though we do have jurisdiction over that, that part of the world, but I don't think the administration was listening to a lot of Republicans or Democrats when they planned or failed to plan for this blunder.
Sure. Bonnie, if I could just touch on that. Obviously, Steve, we will be doing some oversight looking at some of the decision making that took place. But yeah, I was doing some interviews with press in the region, and one of the questions was how countries like Korea or Taiwan or others should take the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I want to be very clear that when we look at a country like Korea or we look at a country like Taiwan, this is a very different situation. These are developed democracies, developed economies. The people of those countries have pretty much decided the direction that they want to go. And certainly, I answered the question in the context of Korea. There's no unwavering of our commitment to Korea. And certainly the reason we put together the Peace and Stability Act is we want to strengthen and make sure the PRC, but also the people in Taiwan understand that we members of Congress care about the people of Taiwan and want them to continue to be able to choose their direction forward. And this is in the face of Chinese aggression at this point. And you're going to hear me say that a lot. We're not the ones who changed the calculus here. Xi Jinping and Chinese, the CCP's aggression towards the people of Taiwan is what's changing the calculus.
We have just maybe a couple of minutes left, and I'll just close with one final question. I'm curious if there are areas of difference that perhaps run along party lines or between committees that maybe you could talk a little bit about when it comes to what policies we should have for Taiwan, or everybody supports, if everybody agrees we should bolster our support for Taiwan, but not everybody agrees we should do so in the same way. So maybe you could just explain some of the differences.
I don't know if you want me to explain and then you say everything I said was wrong, Ami, or do you want to go first and I'll tell them everything you said was wrong?
You can start, since I've got the gavel this Congress and you might have it in the next Congress, you'll get to close.
All right, I'll be nice. I'll just give you one, maybe. Is I think the U.S. I know the Obama administration used to stress this, and others have. I'm not sure to the extent that Biden is going to strengthen this, because as I said, I compliment him for actually getting our allies to speak out on behalf of Taiwan. That's a good thing. But this whole idea of strategic ambiguity, basically not being clear with the PRC that if they take military action against Taiwan, that we'll be there with Taiwan. They need to know that. Now, it's not crystal clear in the Taiwan Relations Act, and the 3 communiques are, all that's bad. But the 6 assurances much better for Taiwan. But we need not strategic ambiguity on whether we'd be there, but we need strategic clarity. We need for China, we need for Chairman Xi to know that if he takes military action against Taiwan, that we will be there with Taiwan. That ought to be clear. I think it's much less likely that he'll act if he doesn't have to wonder if that's the case. If he wonders, he may act. If he doesn't have to wonder, I don't think he will act. I'll yield there.
Great. So that how we use language might be a little bit different in terms of, I was at a conference over the weekend, and the Richard Haas kind of approach to strategic clarity came up, and we had a conversation around that. I use the term strategic deterrence, but deterrence doesn't work without clarity, and that's a subtle difference. And there are multiple tools of deterrence that we have. There's economic deterrence, political deterrence, as well as military deterrence. And I don't know that we have to be entirely clear which of those tools that we would use, but I think we have to be clear that there would be a price to pay if China and Xi Jinping took the PRC in a direction that would really be outside of the norms of the 21st century, taking and invading an autonomous country. I don't want to call it a country, but an autonomous people that really have functioned as a country. I think that what the Biden administration's doing, in building this dialogue, building partnerships with like-valued countries, I think there really is real concern from countries in the region and around the world at the aggression of Xi Jinping. And I think strategic deterrence with some level of clarity of the consequences and the price that the PRC would suffer should they make a misstep here. Whether that deters Xi Jinping, I hope there are others inside the Chinese Communist Party, other decision makers that would understand the economic, political, and potential military challenges that they would face should they make that misstep. And I think Steve and I are using language slightly differently. I don't think we're that far apart on needing to send a clear message to Xi Jinping, and as well as to others in the Chinese Communist Party who hopefully are more moderating decision makers. Who, it's not clear that there is that moderating voice, but we've got to make sure we're communicating with those folks, with our allies. Well.
Yeah, maybe tomato. If I could just make one final point, it didn't take Xi 5 minutes to take advantage of the chaotic pullout in Afghanistan to use it with Taiwan and kind of warn Taiwan that you can't really depend on the United States. So you better do what we tell you to do, and you better knuckle under to us, basically, is what the message was. Now, I don't agree with that, obviously, and I think hopefully that this was an aberration, what happened there with this administration, that they're not going to follow this up around the globe, because if they do, we're all in trouble. All freedom-loving people are in trouble. So I hope the administration gets back on track, because that was a disaster.
Well, I certainly agree with you that the withdrawal from Afghanistan does not have implications for Taiwan or for U.S. commitments to Taiwan. So thank you all for joining us for today's session. We have put in the chat box a link to the text of the Taiwan Peace and Stability Act. I hope everybody will track this legislation and hopefully will get passed, or most elements perhaps in other legislation, because it contains some very important provisions that I think would be very significant in strengthening Taiwan's security going forward. Thank you so much to Congressman Bera and Congressman Chabot for joining us today, and look forward to your continued leadership on so many issues relating to foreign policy going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie, and thanks to the German Marshall Fund. Be well.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.